welcome to another episode of Treknicity, the show where we talk about everything to do with, of course, Star Trek. I'm your host, Lars coming to you from somewhere beyond the cosmos, or perhaps even Southern California, and we all know by now that they're pretty much one and the same. Joining me again for another episode will be my compatriot and fellow co-host as we talk about the differences and similarities between Abramsverse classic characters and Prime Universe classic characters. I shall summon him thusly, Frank.
Rice and love lotion, baby. Excuse me, private moment here, thank you. No, really, thank you. I've been arguing with that bitch all morning. So what's on your mind?
Well, it's time to do our show again.
Okay, yeah, I need the break anyway. I'm glad you pulled me out of that. That was starting to get pretty nasty.
Alrighty then. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I may welcome back the captain, Frank, and he will be joining me again for this episode. As I said, we're going to be talking about the differences and similarities between Abramsverse characters and Prime Universe characters.
Now, there are a lot of characters that have kind of crossed over into both. And because we try to keep this show from running like 5 hours, I think we'd be best if we limit it to like maybe the main bridge crew and one or two extras.
Absolutely, because that's where they focus their attention anyway, so yeah.
But I would like to start personally with the character that I am sure most people had the most to say about. And that's Mr. Spock.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would say that Spock was, well, for me, actually, that's a huge one. And I'm probably going to be in the minority here, but for me, nobody else but Leonard Nimoy could truly play Spock.
I don't know if I would fully agree with nobody else but him could, but what I will say is I don't think anyone will be able to play the character as well as he did, because he had a lot of time to play the character, a lot of time to familiarize himself with the character. It took longer to produce shows when they started with the original series than it does now. So he had a lot of time and energy and effort invested in it. So I would agree that it would take some real doing for anybody to come close to capturing the character the way the late Leonard Nimoy did.
I agree. There is a definitely something to be said about how he portrayed the character, but it isn't just because of how he portrayed the character; it's how he developed the character. And a lot of people may not agree with me in this matter, but when we were talking about previously about the differences in Spock, like on Talos 4 in the episode The Cage, he smiled at the harmonics of the flowers, and also the smug way in which he mocked Kirk in Where No Man Has Gone Before. A lot of that, for anybody who has read or listened to the audiobook of Leonard Nimoy's follow-up to I Am Not Spock, called I Am Spock, there's actually a lot of great information about how that turned out, because initially when Gene Roddenberry filmed The Cage, they sent that to the studio. The studio said, we don't really think so, but tell you what, lose the alien and lose the woman, and you can shoot another pilot. And he ended up marrying the woman and keeping the alien, which I'm paraphrasing. But the thing is that Leonard Nimoy intentionally played Spock the way he played him, in such a way that it fleshed out the character when that character had not been fleshed out previously. Roddenberry had some initial ideas of what the character of Mr. Spock was like, but it was truly Leonard Nimoy's input that developed and made Mr. Spock three-dimensional.
I agree that he succeeded in doing that. However, where you and I are probably going to disagree because it seems you are very highly devoted to the classic portrayals. I believe that Zachary Quinto did not do that bad a job with Mr. Spock. Now, I will say I'm going to caveat that because I will say I don't believe, just like I said at the opening of the show, that his character or his portrayal will ever come close to matching what Nimoy did. But he was a younger Spock, much like the Spock in Discovery. He was still a bit emotional, maybe overly so to some degree, especially with his girlfriend. And that's another thing that, yeah, I'm not so sure about how Spock and Uhura became an item. The only thing that happened in one of the classic episodes was when Spock had the bridge and Uhura tried to have a conversation with him about being tired of being attached to her communications panel. But I didn't really see any kind of indicator that those two would have ever developed romantically.
Well,
however, given that he's a Vulcan and we know Vulcans are passionate, not any Star Trek has ever said they're not passionate, they don't have strong feelings. What everything has said is they learned to get a handle on them because beforehand they were closer to what we think of as the Romulans, and their feelings got away with them, and because they are such a passionate species, they nearly wiped themselves out. So they realized that devoting themselves to logic would help curb the passions on the emotional front, so they were able to keep the species thriving.
Right.
But he had a girlfriend, so you can expect him to be somewhat overly emotional in those circumstances because she was right there with him. The only other example we had of him being attached to somebody was in Amok Time, where he was already betrothed to Pring, I think was her name.
Correct.
And we saw there a different dynamic because she wasn't there with him every day. I think in the first Abrams movie, when he was really mad about Kirk cheating on the Kobayashi Maru, I think that was a little OTT for the character Spock, because I don't think he would have responded quite as severely as he did, even though it was his test that he developed in a Prime Universe portrayal. But again, we're looking at two different universes for the same character. I postulated that last show, and I'm going to stick with that theory this whole show, or anytime we make a comparison, because to me, that is the easiest way to make both of them make sense and still be coherent within what's been come to be known as the Star Trek mythos.
Right.
So
now, as far as the character of Spock having a personal relationship with Uhura, that was explored largely in fan fiction, which, for whatever reason, the producers of the Abramsverse movies decided to pick up on, including Uhura having a first name. Because traditionally, Uhura was the only name we ever knew her by. However, in fan fiction, she was given the name Nyota.
And in novelizations, Star Trek novelizations were done with her having that name. And Sulu had acquired Hikaru from novelizations. We never knew him as anyone but Sulu, right, originally.
Exactly. So, I mean, yes, I can understand that they were portraying a younger version of the character, and with such, comes the passions of youth and such like that. So it is understandable that they did explore some sides of this. For me, where the point of contention is the fact that I think they tried to put too much of an original spin on the character, and didn't leave enough of the classic portrayal in there. Does that make sense?
So you think that they intentionally stripped away a lot of the common elements that we would think of with Spock to explore the other sides of the character's personality?
Right.
That there I might agree with you to some degree, but I've got to say, in Abrams' defense, okay, Spock being a very popular character and even in my age was a well-known individual, people are going to have an interest in seeing some of the rest of what makes him tick. So in that regard, I can't really argue with JJ for putting it in there. Again, I think he went a little over the top, but I can't really argue with him having it in there.
This could actually devolve into a comparison again of the Abramsverse movies against the Prime Universe movies, because my biggest grief with the Abramsverse movies is I felt that they took too many liberties with established canon that didn't do anything to move the plot forward. They were largely MacGuffins, and now if since we are focusing finally on the portrayal of the classic characters by different actors, there are some exceptions to my I don't agree with the Abramsverse portrayals. Sorry, there are some exceptions. That being largely the character of Kirk, or characters of Kirk and Scotty. I felt that Chris Pine did a very good job of playing the hot-headed, hot-blooded James T. Kirk. Despite the fact that I feel like they didn't do the character justice by playing him to his original, like he went to the academy, he was on other starships, and he did become Starfleet's youngest captain, but he was 35. According to canon, he was 35 when he became captain of the Enterprise. You can kind of overlook some of the stuff, but Chris Pine did a good job. He did a really good job of portraying that hot-blooded youth of Kirk. Same goes with Simon Pegg's portrayal of Scotty. There were some areas like Scotty was, despite the fact that he was everybody's favorite drunk Scotsman, he also had an air of regalness to him. There was some, he was honor bound. You could tell that he took pride in who he was and the work he did. With Simon Pegg's portrayal, there was that element to the character. He was very proud of what he did and how he did stuff. But
very proprietorial over his stuff too, because he got real bent out of shape when he learned that Harrison was using his transporter technology to create or to commit his crimes.
True. But the other thing is that for me, I think they watered down the character of Scotty to a running joke. He was the comedic relief.
I will say that Abrams did not give Scotty as much gravitas as we saw in Prime. Simon Pegg had some, but Jimmy Doohan knew. I mean, in his portrayal of Scott, yes, he did get overboard on shore leave and have several misadventures and stuff. But when it came time to be focused on work and where he was at and the ship he was on, anywhere Montgomery Scott went, he made sure people knew and understood, this is Montgomery Scott and I'm the chief engineer aboard the Enterprise. Right. And don't you dare give me any lip about it.
Exactly.
Simon Pegg didn't do that as well. He was more a happy-go-luckier version of Scotty. Yes. Kirk, I have one big problem, and I had it from the beginning, with Chris Pine's portrayal of Kirk versus William Shatner's. Mm-hmm. Chris Pine's Kirk was a wuss. He couldn't defend himself to save himself in hand-to-hand, whereas Bill Shatner's Kirk could kick some butt.
Oh yeah, I mean, I played a role-playing game called Demon Hunters Um, and I had a character named Zap Kirkman, which is a cross between Captain Kirk and Zap Brannigan from Futurama. And one of my abilities was called Everybody Was Kirk Fu Fighting. Um, and that's the thing, is you are right. Shatner's Kirk, even though the mock martial arts known as Kirk Fu was silly, it
Right.
still had that badass, I can take on anything. I mean, he took on the Gorn. He took on the
And
Gorn. Look, to put a spin on it, he took on the Gorn in a parking lot and won.
there you go. Yeah, they dropped him on an asteroid and said, fight it out, and he won. And upon his victory, was still merciful toward his enemy.
Exactly.
Now, the other Kirk, I think, the younger Kirk, Chris Pine's Kirk, probably wouldn't have been as inclined to mercy as Bill Shatner's Kirk.
True, but again, as you do point out, that that portrayal of the character was disingenuous towards the spirit of James T. Kirk as a character. I mean, like I said, I did like the hot-blooded, youthful portrayal of Kirk, but you do make a good point that, yeah, I mean, he just couldn't fight his way out of a wet paper bag.
And I thought that was just ridiculous because James T. Kirk was always a fighter. He wasn't always a good fighter, but he was always a fighter. And when he did get his ass kicked, he still was able to come back afterwards and end up winning over the situation. Chris Pine's Kirk was just a plain wuss. He got whooped and that was it. People had to step in to save him.
Hmm. That is actually a fair point. I really hadn't thought to that point, but you are correct. Um, let's look at a couple other characters. Let's look at the portrayal of Hikaru Sulu. Um, Sulu in the original series, or at least in the Prime universe, um, I think what was really cool about it is that he didn't take lip from anybody. He didn't take crap from anybody. He knew who he was. He knew what he was good at, and he didn't let anybody tell him otherwise.
Pretty common thread through all the Enterprise crew, but yes, I do agree with you.
Right. Now I remember there was some, I guess, controversy about casting John Cho in the role of Sulu for the Abramsverse movies, and largely it's because the character of Hikaru Sulu is Japanese. George Takei is Japanese, so they felt that was an appropriate casting. However, John Cho is Korean, and the one thing he actually came out saying, which was I felt was very appropriate, is that the character of Hikaru Sulu wasn't meant solely to portray the character as a member of the Japanese people. He was designed to represent all of Asia.
Yes.
And so that meant that he could, a Korean who is, is Asian, could represent the character of Sulu.
Or a Hindu, or a Chinese, or a Mongolian. There are various Asian cultures.
Absolutely.
That they could have pulled a representative out of. Now, on the character of Hikaru Sulu, we know from the Prime universe he was just kind of when we think about the episode The Naked Time, we know that at heart he's still an Errol Flynn swashbuckling pirate on the seas. That's the overall inner personality to Sulu.
Right.
We didn't see much of that in the Abramsverse. He was there to do his job. He was very focused on his job. And he had George Takei's same no-nonsense attitude about, yes, I'm running the ship, and yes, I know what I do, and yes, I'm going to make this work. But I think that the younger Sulu was a little more flawed than the older Sulu. And I don't know if it's because of the actor's portrayal or if it's just because we have to think of him as a younger Sulu.
Well, I think that it's worth noting that the writers took liberties that I felt were inappropriate, because the other thing is that they made a joke out of Sulu's abilities when the first time the Enterprise goes to warp and the uh, the external dampener, otherwise known as the speed brake, was still on. Like,
Right.
and this guy is an accomplished helmsman. He would not be so daft as to leave the parking brake on.
Very likely not, yes. Although, in defense of that happening, we've got a younger Sulu, and we were in the middle of a quadrant wide emergency. So he could have easily lost sight of that. I mean, Vulcan was getting destroyed. So, you know.
I don't know about you, but stress tends to make me focus, not become distracted.
Well, I don't know. People say I'm stressed all the time, so I guess you're going to have to determine if that keeps me focused or not.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about that some other time.
Now, I do have one big problem with the portrayal of Hikaru Sulu by the time we get to Beyond. A big problem.
And is that the portrayal of the character being homosexual?
Yes, because we knew the actor George Takei was with the classic Sulu, but we never saw any hint or evidence that would lead us to believe that Sulu himself was gay or inclined toward it. In fact, he seemed to be exactly the opposite. He seemed to be like super hetero for a young man. I mean, even when we look at the episode Mirror Mirror, he's trying to hit on Uhura. He was very, very super hetero in character. Now, the character being portrayed as gay at the end, I don't really think that was bad per se. I just think that there we didn't have any foundation for it, and so it was a bit uncalled for. I think what they were trying to do, but it misfired, was in their own way pay tribute to the actor George Takei.
Yes, I agree. They were doing a nod to Takei and showing that Star Trek is, at its core, accepting and proud of people of all sexual orientations. But again, and you do make a good point. We didn't see anything that indicated that the character wasn't straight, wasn't heterosexual. If they want the character to be gay, well, I mean, that's them. That's on them. Let them do what they want. But it didn't do anything for the character. It didn't make you feel more attached to the character or more invested in the character. It just meant, oh yeah, okay, it's more fan service.
Well, here's what I think. I think John Cho was a good choice for a younger Sulu, personally. When I watched all the movies with all the characters, I could see certain traces of the classic characters. I could recognize them. It's kind of like with Doctor Who. When the Doctor regenerates, you can still recognize the Doctor after a while as being the Doctor. So I saw the characters. I could recognize them as those characters. But parallel universe or not, some things just do not make sense. It did not make sense to suddenly say now Sulu is a gay character. Him being a gay character, I don't give a damn one way or another. There's nothing wrong with that. What I find a problem with is, Sulu is a gay character. Sulu is gay. We had no hint of that. We had nothing that would even lead us to believe he might be prior to that. So that's my biggest gripe with what they did with Hikaru Sulu.
Well, and that makes a lot of sense. Moving on to another classic character, that being of Chekhov. I feel like they brought Chekhov in the second season of the original series because they were trying to tap into the popularity of the Beatles and further the mock band the Monkees.
Correct.
Now, and that is that's represented all day long by Chekhov's hairstyle.
Right, right.
But the way they portrayed uh, Chekhov in the Abramsverse movies, to me, didn't make a lot of sense. First of all, they reduced his age from 21 to 17. I didn't see any point in that. Why? What good would it do? Did it make him any more capable of doing his job? No. They called him the whiz kid, but and and they made him when they're trying to beam up the survivors from Vulcan just as it's blowing up in the first Abrams first movie, he goes running through the ship screaming, I can do this, I can do this, and he's like running to the transporter room. I'm like, why? That character never demonstrated any abilities to do something like that. So all it did is basically make Chekhov look like an idiot because he couldn't save Amanda Grayson.
Spock's mom, yeah. Um, Now, we know that he ended up serving some terms as engineer. We know that he was a weapons officer. So we know he was multi-talented. However, just out of nowhere, out of the blue, running through the ship, I can do this, I can do this. I'm not sure I agree with them having him do that either. Now, do I believe he could operate the transporter and do a tricky maneuver? Absolutely. But I don't really think, from what we saw of Pavel Andreevich Chekhov prior to this, that he would be running through the ship screaming, I can do this. Now, he might insist that he can do it, and he might even pick a fight over, yes, I can do this, and get the hell out of my way and let me do it. Mm-hmm. But I don't really think he would have done what we saw there running through, I can do this, I can do this.
Right. The other thing
now,
is they had
That being said, I'm going to again put a caveat. They did make him 17. He was 17 in the parallel universe when he first started serving aboard the Enterprise. Now, being 17 years old and in the heat of that stressful situation and the destruction of Vulcan, possibly it could happen, but I'm not so sure it could happen with that character.
Mm-hmm. I don't buy it. But I guess no matter what happens, we won't have to see any more of that because of Anton Yelchin's untimely death. It'll be interesting to see what they do if they actually do make another Abrams for Star Trek movie. Although at this point, as far as I understand it, the fourth one that was set to that was in pre-production has now been permanently shelved.
Yes, because the two lead actors, which were supposed to be dad and son Kirk, decided they weren't going to participate. That's one of the biggest factors.
Right.
Why they decided, I don't really know. You'd have to check YouTube or other articles, but I know that's one of the biggest factors. I think the other is they didn't know what to write or where to go to beyond, if you can pardon the pun a little bit.
Well, they had a script. They actually had a script, a workable script. To my knowledge, a lot of it came down to money. They wanted
that'll
money.
Do it.
So we probably won't see these characters portray this again, but we still have Zoe Saldana's portrayal of Uhura. I did like it, but I felt that Nichelle Nichols by far had much more class than Zoe Saldana as far as the portrayal of Uhura. She was good, but I felt like she was just a little too arrogant.
I would almost say, and I don't like using this word because it can be construed as a prejudiced term, and I don't mean it to be. I don't mean it to be a slur, but the Zoe Saldana's Uhura, especially from what I saw aboard the ship, not so much when she was in the bar, but aboard the ship and so on, she almost had like a ghetto attitude, if you know what I mean, a real meh kind of thing.
Yeah.
Whereas Nichelle Nichols, even when we knew that Uhura was upset or something, she never quite did it that way. She handled it in a, I don't know if classier is the right word, but in a less um, aggressive fashion.
Perhaps a more mature.
Yeah, there's an excellent word, mature. But then again, Uhura is more mature in the Prime than she is in Abramsverse.
Right. Well, and it comes down to they had to find an actress who could portray the character in a way that did so in broad strokes, and Zoe Saldana did do that. There was some bitchiness to it that I felt was much more akin to a CW drama as opposed to you know a big
An
screen movie.
actual Star Trek story.
Yeah. So, and I take that issue with a lot of shows that remind me of that they belong on the CW. Um, the first season of Supergirl was a dead giveaway that they belonged not on on CBS, but they belonged on the CW because it was a massive drama fest. Um, and again, this movie, these sets of movies um, are no different. The character was portrayed in such a way that she was much more, you know, I guess dramatic than her counterpart.
And a lot more aggressive.
True. Yes.
Think about it. When Spock was assigning people during the destruction of Vulcan, she literally walks up to him and tells him, "You're putting me on the Enterprise, damn it."
Yeah. That's pretty much that is true. Yep. I agree with that.
And
Um,
that's what I mean by that kind. Again, bad term, but that's the best word I can come up with to describe carrying yourself in that fashion. Whether you're an African American actor or Caucasian or Mexican or whomever, whomever you are, that's the best word I think that describes the way she carried herself there.
hmm. Well, that being said, um, I'd like to finish off this episode with my favorite character portrayal from the Abramsverse, and that being Carl Urban's portrayal of Leonard Nimoy, or not Leonard Nimoy, Leonard McCoy. Sorry.
Leonard McCoy, Leonard H.
Yes. Um, I feel like he had that attitude about him where he felt defeat. It was kind of defeatist, which was in a similar fashion or spirit of D. Kelly's portrayal of McCoy, but
Unquestionably.
he was still a bit of a rustler, a good old fashioned country boy. He just um, you immediately identified with him. I felt that Carl Urban did capture D. Kelly's spirit.
If I were to look at the various portrayals and pick a most accurate, I would probably agree with what you're saying too, because Dr. McCoy, Leonard McCoy, um, was never happy with spaceflight. Which made no sense because he was working in Starfleet, but he was never happy with it.
Mm.
He didn't trust technology. He certainly didn't like his atoms scattered all over God's creation. He and Carl Urban did a really, really, really good job of carrying that personality into his character. He had the right amount of sarcasm that you could attribute to D. Kelly. He held his own against Spock. The best way you could see D. Kelly holding against Leonard Nimoy, he held his own against Zachary Quinto Spock. If I were to say a most accurate portrayal of any of the characters, I would have to say it was Carl Urban's Bones McCoy.
Oh, absolutely. Um, I I would have watched the movies further just for his portrayal, but again, did a great job. There's some areas I still think D. Kelly did a better job at, but again, they had the benefit of being the first to portray those roles. So they developed them. They made them their own. Somebody else coming in afterwards, you have to wonder. Okay, well, I guess it's not the same. You know, they're not. They're having to portray something that somebody else developed. So you can understand a little bit.
Right. Now, I believe, personally, all of the Abramsverse portrayals would have been better if the actors themselves, the cast, were given more liberty to develop the characters as their own. I think that there was just too much, like you said, they wrote them differently. There was too many constraints on how the portrayals could be done. I don't really believe the cast got a fair shot at doing their own takes on the characters as much as they would have wanted to, or I believe they should have.
Right. Well, I guess we may not see that developed any further, but in the meantime, me personally, I feel I'm much more attached to the Prime Universe portrayal of the characters, but there are some merits to the Abramsverse portrayals as well.
And speaking of characters, I think we pretty much covered the whole bridge crew, so we can bring this one to a close. How about in a couple weeks, because I know there's some things going on and I might need some time myself. How about in a couple weeks we talk about characters where they belong in a role-playing game? Now, there have been several Star Trek role-playing games, but I would like to talk more about the development of your own role-playing game, what you might do. I know you have probably had some experience developing or playing or running role-playing games, and I know a lot of my origin, if you will, was attached to role-playing games. So I believe that would be a good place to go to next.
I agree, and in 2 weeks we will be back with another episode of Treknicity, where we will be talking about role-playing in the Star Trek universe. So, with that being said, I have been your host, Lars Desenza, and with me has been the Captain, or Flint.
And until 2 weeks from now, rock out
with
your
your
Spock out.
Bye, folks.